Yes. Well, Bob Dylan was doing the music. He's part of this talk today. Um, so we'll start with those are pictures from my basement, by the way, where my office used to be. Uh, and so, I'm going to really try to do this in about 25 minutes, so that we'll have a good enough time to sit and then to uh, have a good conversation. So, what do Bob Dylan, Dante Alighieri, an abandoned office in my basement, Rainer Maria Rilke, John of the Cross, my three marriages, John Lennon, and a jumping mouse all have in common? Uh, this particular talk began about 2:15 this morning when I woke up from a dream and remembered the mouse that jumped out of my garbage. And that life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. To even begin to try to explain about the mouse and everything else in the dream, I have to rewind the tape about a week back to Deb Ackerson's talk last Sunday on the alchemy of depression. Uh, if you missed that talk, uh, thanks to my son, it's listed on YouTube. The Alchemy of Depression. I really recommend you go to that talk. After that talk, which was, I thought, really a brilliantly brave talk, I knew that I had to do the next talk on the dark night of the senses. Um, I've never really had the kind of depression that Deb talked about, and many people talked about in the just one of the best uh, conversations I think we've had in 4 years in terms of the people really responding to the talk, and then bravely talking about their own bouts with depression. Um, and I had a talk all prepared for today. I put that sort of on the back burner. It's a good talk, but maybe for some other time. And then I just said, well, I said, I've got to really talk about the dark night of the senses. Uh, this is an interspiritual community that, it's the center of it is meditation. Uh, and if you follow that path that and really practice meditation on a consistent basis, you're going to run into what John of the Cross called the dark nights, the dark night of the senses, the dark night of the soul, and then even sometimes the dark night of the spirit. But I want to talk. I wanted to, I said, well, I'm going to talk about the dark night of the senses. So I worked through the week on uh, on that talk, and it was really, gee, I learned so much. And but then this morning, when I had this dream, I just woke up and couldn't get back to sleep, and so I had to write about that. And so that's this talk. I've had about 4.5 hours of sleep here, so hopefully something good will come from it. Uh, and and then I want to talk specifically about the dark nights that I've been through so far in 50 years of being on this path. Uh, the dark nights, so called, and John of the Cross, in the dark night of the soul, and in his living flame of love, the poetry. He's the master of sort of giving us a look at this. The dark nights, they will occur, and pretty much for one reason. The dark nights occur. You might be in one now. They occur for one reason: to wake us up to the great question, to one of the great questions that life poses. I think life uh, has, a few great questions up their sleeve, But this one definitely is what comes with the dark night of the senses. And so here's the question: what gets in the way of my innate capacity to receive and give love? What gets in my way? What gets in the way of my innate capacity to receive and give love? Now, that's the question that surfaced in during the dark night for me, and I think it's sort of the dark night question. You start to get a sense of what is getting in the way of your innate capacity. We all have this; it's born in us, an innate capacity to receive and give love. Uh, and you start to during the dark night, which can go on for a while. Uh, you start to get a sense of what that is. Um, Dante. Dante in the 13th, well, he was living in the 13th and the 14th century, but he was the great. He first talked about it, but not in those terms. He wrote the Divine Comedy. It was just called a commedia. Later, it was everybody thought it was so great they called it the Divine Comedy, but it was a commedia, and it just really meant uh, he was sketching out the Dark Knight, all of them. So he fell in love uh, with Beatrice, the woman he met on the bridge in Florence. He just swooned and he fell in love with her. And then she died of the plague. Uh, they were both married to other people, which made it, difficult. Uh, and uh, and so he just couldn't, get over this. He wanted to go to heaven to be with her. He knew she was in heaven, and so he in the comedy he tries to go right up to the to heaven, but he can't. He's turned back. It's very interesting. About 1,000 lines of Italian poetry later, he does meet her. That's why it's called a comedy, because classical comedy, if it ends well, it's called a comedy, even though you go through hell to get there. And he did. So here's the first line of these 1,000 lines in Italian. He said, "No mezzo del cammin de nostra vita," midway in life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood, the true way, completely lost. And then it begins. Uh, Midway in life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood, the true way, completely lost. Uh, yeah, I know the meaning of those words. You may too. And if you don't yet, you will. That's that's what Deb was getting at last week as well. There's a difference between the dark nights, and clinical depression, of course, but they're both dark. And you will go through darkness, like it or not. Whether most people don't even know they're on the spiritual journey. You are. We're human and divine, and so your life's journey is a spiritual journey. But most people don't really know that. But they're on it nonetheless. And the fact that you can be conscious about it, and the fact that there are guides for this, is just great. You know, Dante was one, and Dante didn't. He said, "Oh, he got lost. I mean, he just lost it, and he lost the thread of life. And but then, a dead Roman poet, his favorite, Virgil, shows up. He says, "I'll show you how you can get to her, but you can't go straight to heaven. You got to go through hell and purgatory first." And so he goes down these 9 descending rings of just unbelievable torture and hell, uh, and even goes past Lucifer, who's flapping his wings, stuck in ice, and then he has to climb up the 7-story mountain to get out from the center of the earth to the surface again. This all happens, by the way, uh, as you know, in the weekend of Easter. So I mean, the symbology is unbelievable. Uh, and then he, you know, when he gets to the surface, there's another mountain that ends up with a rose there, and you know, beatific vision and all that. It's just beautiful. But the night of the dark nights, and especially the dark night of the senses, is the purgatory part, the seven-story mountain. Uh, that was Merton's title of his autobiography, of how he just sort of lost his mind and got totally lost in life, and then entered the monastery. And purgatory is really misunderstood. Purgatory really means the hard work of working with what gets in between you and paradise, you and heaven. It's working with the things that get in the way. What gets in the way of my innate capacity to receive love and to give love? I began meditating over 50 years ago. And I was just calculating this out this week as I was working with it. I probably spent 30% of that time in the dark night of the senses. And the dark night of the senses look different than the dark night of the soul, and then even the dark night of the spirit, these three dark nights that John talks about. The dark night of the senses is full of emotional kind of upheaval. And you're dealing with a lot of emotion in that time, and that throws you off balance. You know, maybe different, you guys who have dealt with really serious depression. So, you know, sometimes depression is, it's, as you've been talking about it, and what I read about is that it can be almost like a deadening thing, like you barely get out of bed. I I worked with a woman in Nashville when I was doing my early retreat stuff, just down at Harmony Landing. I worked with a woman who spent all winter sitting in a chair. She told me when she started working with me. I said, "You sat for a whole winter in a chair?" Yeah. I said, "How?" I had never had anything like that. And I said, "Well, how could you sit in a chair all winter?" And she said, "I didn't have the energy to get up." And she was the most depressed person I'd ever met at that time. She married five guys, uh, and they were all just like her father, the sixth guy who abused her. It was She got out of it though. She got out of the chair, and hopefully she's doing well. I've lost touch with her, but that's a different kind of thing. But it's dark, and you'll run into one way or the other. But dark night of the senses is different. It's just so much emotion that your dark emotions, emotions that blindside you don't even know, and all of it's coming from the basement. You see, it's coming from the unconscious, and it's tough. Spend 30% of about 15 years of the 50 years when I was looking at uh, things that probably I've been in that, and it's a struggle. Struggling in the dark to become aware of this question: what gets in the way of my innate capacity to receive and give love? You know, uh, if you get nothing else from this talk, you've got that question, and that question is priceless. It took me a long time to realize that's what was going on. That I was, and the Tibetans say, and I think they're right. Uh, Recognition and liberation is simultaneous. To recognize even that question and to begin to recognize what gets in the way. Everybody is, life is very sorrowful. Was for me at times, and that everybody wants to be happy. They want to be filled with joy. They want peace, rest, and natural great peace. Uh, and we have the innate capacity to do it, but there's things that get in the way that we don't even see. So to recognize the things that are getting in the way is the start. It's almost liberation begins when you recognize, when you even have this question, even if it means nothing to you now. This is a good question. Monday, is my Sabbath day. Uh, I work, uh, Tuesday through, well, sometimes even Saturdays all the way to Sundays, the day I always show up for work, sort of living like a priest now. Uh, Monday's my Sabbath day, and I was up before dawn this last, and I was excited about, bouncing off and getting some leverage from Deb's talk. And I was brewing a cup of coffee, and I had something to throw in the garbage. We have one of these kind of things that um, built in a car. You can pull out a drawer, and there's the garbage can in it, and you can push it back. So you don't always see the garbage can. So I pulled it out, and a mouse jumped out of the garbage can, landed on the floor at my feet, and then disappeared through it's sort of the AC vent on the floor. I didn't know mice could jump. There was, and maybe he was who was more scared. He probably was more scared than I was, And but it was a kind of a jolt, and then he went down. Probably headed down to the basement. They all come in somewhere through the basement and then come up when they do. And so that was something that was in my consciousness and didn't, it was just sort of a weird thing, but it started to uh it was perking in my unconscious all week and then came into the dream today. A mouse jumping out of the garbage, a deep symbol of what happens. uh you deal with a lot of stuff you'd rather not see in the dark nights. uh and yesterday, and I think all this packed into this dream that came through that was so meaningful that really uh sorry, derailed the talk I was going to give, which I'm going to give you. Who knows? I think I'm planning on giving it, but you know, uh, John Lennon said, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. I had a talk planned, and then this came up. Yeah. Yesterday, Elizabeth and I began cleaning out my old office in the basement. I haven't been in there for years. Dusty, filled with cobwebs. I've avoided doing this for years, and there's something symbolic about that. And I realize a connection in the dream actually, that we avoid the stuff in the basement, don't we? Um, it's dark down there, and it's not really that pleasant. That's sort of what the Dark Knight is. Um, and when I was going through this stuff, and we were putting a lot of it in garbage bags, I used to do all my work down there. And then when my knees started going out, I couldn't really go to the basement uh, at that time. Now I can come and go, but and I moved upstairs. But these things I was handling, save, throw away, that kind of stuff, uh, I was seeing some symbols of all the things that got in the way, but also I was seeing items, pictures. That's why I was putting up in the screensaver pictures of some things around there, especially the people that I worked with during those days. Uh, I could see the light and the treasure I discovered along the way. So it's quite a interesting trip when you actually, if you meditate, if you have a practice, if you have a real spiritual practice, these things will come up from the unconscious to be dealt with. That's the terrible beauty of it, you know. Uh, but I guess when I think of when I think of really uh, what I got out of Deb's talk, out of your talk, Deb, and then what so many people got out of it was that, and this is another John, uh, John the Evangelist, in the opening to his gospel, he has this line: "There's a light in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it." He's not saying there's light and darkness. He's saying there's a light in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. And that's, when you were talking, Deb, about um, the alchemy of depression. Alchemy is the ancient alchemists, they had a crucible where they could fire to a terrific amount of heat. And then, the idea was they could turn, you know, lead into gold just by adding the heat and then whatever other things they were doing, whatever other chemicals they added. These are the original chemists, but they were working with something that was dark and that became precious. And really, that's what happens along the journey. And it's, I don't know any. This has just been my experience. I don't believe that line. I've lived that line. Now next week, I mean, this is my plan now. You know, life is what happens, and talks for me are what happens when I'm busy making other plans. But next week, I really want to talk specifically about the things that things that got in the way for me, and I've never talked about all that before. I actually got quite a bit of courage from your talk, Deb. Um, what are the things that get in the way for you, okay, on this trip? On this trip, you know. So, uh, I think that's I'm going to invite you today when we segue into our time of silent meditation. And uh, the difference between prayer and meditation or contemplative prayer, meditation and contemplative prayer are the same thing. The difference between prayer and those two things is that prayer involves words, like I'm seeking. In a way, it talks a prayer. We're using words to point to something that really can't be talked about. You know, you have to experience things for yourself, of course, but we can use words. And looking around this place, all these faces, all these teachers that were used their words to point me towards what couldn't be spoken, it could only be experienced. So, if nothing else, I want to segue into our sitting, and then if you're listening to this on tape, go for it as well. Uh, I want you to sit for today's 20-minute time in meditation. I invite you to sit with this question: what gets in the way of my inner capacity to receive and give love? That's where Rilke comes in. Rilke was the great guy. His poem, Living the Questions. If he did nothing else but write that little paragraph, he was writing a letter to a young poet. He said, have patience with everything unresolved in your life. And if you're on this journey consciously, you're going to run into a lot of situations and a lot of emotions and a lot of relationships that are mysterious and unresolved. And he says, have patience with everything unresolved in your heart and learn to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for answers because they could not be given to you, because you would not be able to live them. He says, live the questions now. And then one day, without even realizing it, you will have lived your way into the answer. That is exactly the way it is, at least in my experience. And so as we end, we'll end the tape in a moment, and then we'll actually segue into our meditation. But I'm gonna invite you. There's no meditation police. You can sit with whatever, and a lot of times, if you start sitting with a question, something else comes up. That's just the nature of it. But I'm going to invite you to start sitting with this question: what gets in the way of my innate capacity to receive and give love. One of the big ones. Okay, well, I think that's good enough, Joe, for the tape.